Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Food Safety for Organic Growers in Texas. My name is Robert Maggiani, and I'm a Sustainable Ag Specialist with the Texas office of the National Center for Appropriate Technology, more commonly known as NCAT. NCAT is a national nonprofit organization with 6 regional headquarters across the country, the central office in Butte, Montana. We work on issues pertaining to sustainable agriculture, sustainable energy, and sustainable communities. This webinar comes to you from the Southwest Regional Office located in San Antonio, Texas. Today's webinar is part of NCAT's grant project with USDA-Rural Development Office to develop a feasibility study for an organic produce food hub in Texas. We know that the market in Texas for organic produce at retail is around $300 million per year, and that almost none of that comes from Texas. The purpose of the grant is to see what can be done to change that situation for the benefit of Texas farmers and communities. Today's presentation will be about 45 minutes long, and we'll follow it up with time for questions from you folks who are attending. As you're listening, you can type in any questions you might have in the question box on your screen, and I'll gather them up and have the speakers answer as many as we can after Dr. Anciso finishes his presentation. Please don't hesitate to ask questions during the webinar. Chances are we won't be able to get to them all during the webinar, but NCAT Sustainable Ag experts will get back to you about your questions by way of email in the days to come. And the next hour or so isn't the only chance for you to ask questions. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on NCAT's ATRA webpage. There's a feature on the page called Ask an Ag Expert where you can send us emails with any questions you might have. Or you might want to call our Sustainable Ag helpline number, which is 1-800-346-9140. We welcome your questions on any sustainable ag subject, not just today's webinar topic. It's worth mentioning also that it's a free service. If you didn't get the phone number and web address, don't worry. We'll have it on screen at the end of the webinar. Also, before we begin, I just want to remind you viewers to take a few minutes to complete the survey for today's webinar. When the webinar is over and you sign out, you'll get the survey right away. This will help us improve our webinars in the future, and we appreciate your taking part in it. One purpose of today's webinar is to bring you up to date on the progress of the Food Safety Modernization Act, which will be implemented by FDA. It has been in the rulemaking process since its passage in 2010 and is actually close to implementation in steps. The other purpose of today's webinar is to acquaint the viewers with the basics of good agricultural practices, or GAPs, on the farm and how to deal with an audit. Our first speaker today will be Susie Marshall from Dallas. Susie has advanced degrees from SMU and Texas A&M University at Commerce. She is the Executive Director of Grow North Texas, which is a nonprofit organization involved in food systems issues in North Texas. She is also the President of the Texas Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association, what we call TOFGA, which is a grower-based nonprofit that provides research, marketing, and production support to its members. TOFGA also hosts a yearly conference that is the largest gathering of organic producers in Texas. Next year's conference will be hosted in January up in Rockwall near Dallas. The next speaker will be Dr. Juan Anciso, who is an extension specialist in vegetables and citrus at Texas A&M University. Dr. Anciso received his PhD from Texas A&M in plant pathology. His areas of specialty are pest management, vegetable production, and food safety. He represents Texas on the National Good Agricultural Practices Committee and United Fresh's GAP harmonization effort that addresses gaps in food safety and produce production. He has received grants from the Texas Department of Agriculture to teach GAPs for many years, and he's personally taught this topic to more Texas producers than anyone else in the state. So now I'll turn the microphone over to you, Susie. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. So this FSMA thing, you've probably been hearing at least something about it. Maybe you've heard a lot, and maybe you've even commented on some of the rules when the comment period was open. But the Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA, is the first time that there's been comprehensive overhaul of food safety practices in our country at the federal level since 1938. Basically, FSMA includes two things to pay attention to as producers. The first one is the produce rule that provides regulations for farms growing fresh fruits and vegetables, and then the preventative controls rule for facilities that hold and process food. So this is something that most farms will have to deal with in at least some ways. There are some exemptions that we'll talk about in a few minutes, but most everybody will have to pay attention to it. Some of the basics to know, the things to know about FSMA is that really there's a lot of common sense. There are probably a lot of food safety practices that you're already doing, and FSMA will require you to write those things down and create some plans and put some things in place. But you'll find a lot of it is going to be common sense to you as a producer. The bill was signed into law in 2011. The final rule is set to be released later this year, and then we'll have 2 and more years, depending, to come into compliance with the rules. So there's some things coming up you'll need to know about. Next slide. So how does this apply to you as a producer? So first of all, the produce rule. If you are a producer who grows, harvests, packs, and holds produce to be eaten by others, there will probably be some part of the produce rule that you'll have to pay attention to and be in compliance with. The produce rule covers fruits and vegetables that are typically eaten raw. Produce that's rarely consumed raw is not covered, nor is produce that receives additional processing. But basically, if you are producing a variety of fruits and vegetables, you'll probably fall under the produce rule. And this is going to cover operations that are selling more than $25,000 worth of food each year on average. So there are actually 4 categories of compliance. The first one is the exemption that says that farms that are selling $25,000 or less per year are not covered under the produce rule. They do not have to be in full compliance with the rule. Next screen. So the second category is modifications. There's some exemptions and modified requirements for farms meeting these 2 requirements that are listed here. If you have food sales averaging less than $500,000 a year over a 3-year period, and the majority of your sales are going to qualified end users, then you meet requirements for modified compliance with the rules, modifications and exemptions to certain parts of the produce rule. So a qualified end user includes direct marketing as well as retail outlets or restaurants, as long as they are within the same state or not more than 275 miles away. So that will cover most everyone in that category. The third category of compliance provides for extended time to get everything in line and in compliance with FSMA rules. We'll touch on that in a minute. And then the fourth category is full compliance, which is going to be mostly larger operations that are producing fruits and vegetables, but they're quite large. Next slide. So the next part of the FSMA rules are the preventative control rule. This is going to cover manufacturing, processing, packing, and or holding food, either on farm or off farm. So if you're doing those things, you will have to comply with at least parts of the preventative controls rule. There is still some clarification coming down on exactly what a facility will be considered. So that's still something to pay attention to. But if you have a facility on farm or off farm that processes and or holds food for sale for human consumption, there will probably be some preventative controls rules you have to comply with. And the rules vary based on the food and the processing, and there are also modifications based on size and operation. And because this gets a little tricky, we're going to next slide, please. There is a helpful flow chart, and that's provided by the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. And I know that's a long URL right there, but if you actually, you can either come back to the recording and write that down, or you can search FSMA flowchart, and you should be able to find this chart from the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. The flowchart's helpful if you're not sure. If you are not sure of where you fall in this, the flowchart will help you identify some of the modifications and exemptions that occur. Okay, next slide. When will farms have to do all of these things? You can see that the final rule publications are coming in the next few months before the end of the year. Larger operations will have required compliance for 1 year after the rule, and all of this obviously varies based on exactly the timeline that actually ends up occurring. But there are modifications to that time frame, and you can see at the bottom of this slide, for very small farms, remember that farms with sales less than $25,000 are exempt from compliance. Very small farms, so sales between $25,000 and $250,000, will have 4 years from the effective date of the rule to comply, plus an additional 2 years for certain water requirements. Next slide. Small farms with sales between $250,000 and $500,000 will have 3 years from the effective date, plus another 2 for certain water requirements. And then farms with sales greater than $500,000 will have 2 years following the effective date, plus the 2 years for certain water requirements. Next slide. So what will you really have to do as a producer? And there are 2 main things to pay attention to: the food safety plan and then GAP certification. The food safety plan is something that most farmers will need to have in place, and again, this is going to be a lot of common sense things, probably things that you already do and are aware of, but we just have to put it into an organized plan that's written down that can be viewed by someone else. And then GAP certification is something that a lot of the wholesalers are requiring, and larger operations will need to be in compliance with. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Anciso to talk more about each of these.
Thank you, Susie. I know that we're basically talking about GAPs this morning, and basically many times when we hear the word GAPs, we know that it stands for Good Agricultural Practices. However, most people think when they think of good agricultural practices, they think that that means, controlling their pests, fertilizing correctly. But in actuality, when we start using this acronym GAPs, I want certainly the growers and people to understand that it basically means food safety on the farm. Next slide. And this is a generalized definition of good agricultural practices, and basically the whole purpose of practicing GAPs on your farm is to basically provide environmental, health, and sanitary practices that aid in the production of safe fruits and vegetables. We're all aware of all the microbial outbreaks that have occurred, whether it's Salmonella, E. coli 015787, or Listeria. Of course, GAPs not only encompasses microbial pathogens that may enter the produce, but it also addresses pesticides and many other things. But I will primarily focus on the microbial aspect. Next slide, please. Let me talk about, at least on the microbial side of GAPs, or food safety on the farm. If we were to be involved with these practices, or this method or understanding of good agricultural practices, some of the facts out there is that even if you do apply these practices, we will never have 100% control of the microorganisms. That's just simply impossible. These produce crops are grown outside, and in reality, we're consuming these microorganisms in very small amounts each and every day. The whole problem basically exists when there's a contamination event in which these numbers are above this baseline and creates problems. So what can growers do? Well, basically, they can take a strategy to reduce risk. All we're trying to do is to reduce that risk of microbial contamination, knowing that we will never be 100% effective in it. But just reducing the risk, we know that will improve the food safety of our produce items. And it's basically like I tell all the growers that I work with, these microorganisms, these bad microorganisms, do not live on produce. They must get there through some contamination event. Well, what are other things that as a grower you could do? Basically, this involves a system of accountability. And that accountability basically involves understanding some of the GAP practices, which many are common sense, and at the same time writing them down and basically developing this farm food safety plan and record keeping to basically show anyone that would walk into your operation that you are following these practices and have an understanding of GAP's food safety. Next slide. Well, are they required by law? That's probably the first question I get from a lot of people today, and it can be a little bit confusing since we've been talking about FSMA since 2011. Well, as of today, they're not mandatory by law, but we expect this part of the produce rule to basically take effect this fall. Although we can never be 100% sure with the federal government whether that will occur this fall or years to come, we feel very confident that something will be coming out this fall. Will it become legally binding once FDA comes out with these rules? Well, yes, it will be a legally binding document as a law that produce growers must follow. Of course, within the law, there will be exemptions and modifications to the law. So that's where we're trying to educate everyone to understand whether you're exempt or you're part of this modification of the law. However, like I again mentioned to growers, no one is exempt from getting anyone ill through their practices. And that's one part of this particular law that in the past recalls have been quote unquote voluntary when something has come up. Now the FDA will have the authority to make them mandatory. And also in the past, FDA has never really been able to walk onto farms because produce was exempt from the food law. So now FDA can come onto farms and look into their practices and do cursory audits of what's occurring. So, however, currently, many of the large retailers across the United States already have some mandatory aspect of GAP's certification for producers selling into the retail outlet. Next slide. Well, what would be some of the basic requirements that when we talk about a GAP's food safety plan or practices? Well, first and foremost, you got to have an actual plan written down. We can call it a plan or a manual, and many times people think that it's a rather short thing, a couple of paragraphs. And in reality, this plan is really catered to how you grow your crops and what you do. So you really can't take somebody else's template and just slap your name and phone number, and that would be your food safety plan. So, through the course of the presentation, I'll try to give you some examples and places of where you could help develop this specific food safety plan for your operation. Within the plan, you have to have a designated food safety person. If you're the grower, harvester, mechanic, and everything, well, then that would mean you. If you have employees and you designate an individual as a food safety person, we want that part of the plan to be in the plan, but also make it as visible as possible. If you have an office or a place that people come in, display that person's name and contact information, generally a phone number, and that shows the awareness that that there is someone that is responsible for food safety on your operation. Other aspects of a food safety plan basically involve standard operating procedures. In other words, things that you do that are routine, whether you clean the restrooms or the belts or the things where you pack your produce. All these things can become routine things, as well as routine trainings, employee trainings that you must do once a year. All this would be part of the record-keeping process that would go into your food safety plan. Of course, there would be documents spelling out how you grow your produce and how you grow it through the season and how you harvest it. And this could mean specific logs or record keeping, and we do have certain logs and forms that people could utilize. Again, I want to emphasize not all the logs that may apply to your operation, but at least it gives you an idea. Another part of the food safety plan would be understanding the water quality that you're using, whether you're irrigating your crop or washing your produce. And that may entail that you do some microbial water testing, depending on which part of the law you fall under. And it could also mean that within this food safety plan, you may choose to pursue a third-party audit, meaning a private company, or in this case, the government as well. The USDA can provide third-party GAPS food safety audits as well. So it's not to lead up to having a third-party audit within this law, but it's basically if you did not pursue a third-party audit because you did not sell to large retailers, that you would have everything very similar as to what a third-party auditing company would want to see. Next slide. Well, I think for growers, the easy part of implementing some of these things of the FSMA law would be to develop this food safety plan or manual. You have two options. I myself can help you develop one for your operation, or you can go online and develop one yourself at www.onfarmfoodsafety.org. And I would probably at this point in time prefer you to go online and make an attempt of trying to develop your food safety plan through this website. Once you've developed it, I would be glad to review it and look at it for you and comment on it and see that you have possibly everything that I would believe would be necessary in a food safety plan. Second, of course, you're going to have to designate someone. Someone's going to have to say, I am the food safety person in charge, and contact information. Next slide. I think some of the hard things that growers in trying to develop this food safety plan that's going to be hard for them is that many of the things that you already do are not written down, whether it's washing hands, training individuals. I think a lot of that record-keeping portion that I think that can be burdensome and certainly will be time-consuming is some of the things that are going to be difficult to make it part of your routine in a farming operation. So that's going to be a hard thing. Again, keeping logs, keeping records up to date on your food safety items. I know that when we try to keep record keeping things, we might be lax and wait a week to enter information. But if you were to be audited and you were lax and weren't entering pieces of information that needed to be entered on a daily basis, that could view as something that could would be a negative in terms of an auditing situation. Again, doing these routine trainings with your employees or yourself, again, if you were to get involved with GAPS on-farm certification, or even just in comply with the FSMA law, these things are routine, they're yearly. It's not you do it once and you're done for the rest of the year. So that's going to be something that, it's going to be something you're going to have to do each and every year. So you might be hearing the same piece of information for many years to come. And so I think that would be a hard part of this aspect. And again, if you do choose to go through a third-party auditing company, passing that audit can be difficult, especially if it's your first time and not sure, because depending on the company and even the auditors within the company, they can make it it could be difficult to pass on your first try. Next slide. Well, what are some of the common sense of some GAP practices? Well, certainly what we're trying to do when I'm talking about microbial contamination is prevention. If everything that you do on your farm, you're trying to prevent animal and human fecal matter to get near or on your produce, you've done everything you possibly could to basically minimize that risk of microbial contamination. In addition to this microbial contamination, it could be facilities or even workers in which sanitation plays a role. We cannot have our coal piles of produce items next to where we may be packing. Also, we may not, certainly we cannot be packing some of our products under trees. And again, those are just common sense things. There's no research that shows that packing under a tree creates this produce item more likely or increases the risk of contamination. So a lot of things are common sense. Of course, worker hygiene. Do workers know and actually wash their hands correctly? Do they come with clean clothes, or do they continue to come with dirty clothes? Again, common sense things. Also, keeping these records of the trainings and the GAP practices employed would be a major part of the practices that we've previously discussed that would be very important into a GAP's on-farm food safety program. And last but not least is an area that I work a lot in, and that's water. Whether it's irrigation water or washing the produce item at the end to remove the dirt. Your first mindset when we think about these microbial pathogens is just think when you see water, you're seeing microbial pathogens there, or the potential for microbial pathogens to, one, have the access to be spread around and the moisture for them to at least maintain, and even if they have some nutrients, to reproduce and increase. Next slide. Again, if you were to attempt this third-party audit process, some of the recommendations I would certainly encourage you to do is go through a training first. Again, there's many trainings that are out about nationally, including in Texas. I know that the Cornell University is going to be providing training on the new FSMA rules, and they'll be coming to many parts. I'm hoping they do come to Texas, but they will come somewhere in the Southwest. Trainings that I do, trainings that other extension people do can help you pass that third-party audit. Again, go through a checklist to make sure that you have everything in place and have that documentation that in most cases these auditing companies are asking for. Again, I've often gotten phone calls on a Friday saying, they're harvesting watermelons and their retailer wants them to be, GAP certified, as of last week, and they want to be certified in that day, and they haven't done anything to in this process to get GAP certified. And one thing that I suggest is at least have 3 months worth of records before you even attempt this audit. And again, when you do have an audit, you want these auditors to come during the production time so they can see. It would be kind of like health inspectors going to the restaurants and seeing, cursory seeing things. Again, they're going to depend a lot on your records, at least an on-farm audit versus a restaurant being audited. Next slide. So here are some websites. I know there's many websites of some examples of some third-party auditors. This is not a totally inclusive list of all the auditors in the United States, but certainly a list of some of the auditors, and there's probably at least 15 to 25 others that are not on this list that may be closer to you and may work with you. The only suggestion I would have on the which auditing company you choose, whether you choose the government, USDA, or a private company, is if you are going to be required to have this audit, ask the people, ask the retailers that who are the auditing companies they prefer or want to see, because if you just choose one randomly, it may be one that's not on the list of maybe some of the retailers you may sell some of your product to. Next slide. Again, in passing this GAP audit or GAP certification, I think people, worry that their farm is not in a perfect condition, and I basically try to emphasize we don't need a perfect score. We don't need a score of 100. As long as you achieve a passing score, that GAP certification is good for 1 year. I know for the USDA, the passing score is a score of 80 percentile and above, but private companies have their own numbers to pass, but they all don't have these perfect scores. So you can have some areas where you're weak in and some areas that are strong, that you're strong in, and you want to at least have enough strong areas to pass that audit. Next slide. Well, I'm just going to briefly touch upon some of the key areas, some of the areas that the FDA came out with a guidance document back in 1998, and it tried to at least briefly touch upon water, manure, worker health, sanitary facilities, field sanitation, packing facility, and transportation. Next slide. So principle number one, all we're trying to do is prevent this microbial contamination. Once the product's been contaminated, basically you cannot clean it up. So prevention is the best thing. Next slide. Principle number two, anywhere you can start to employ these good agricultural practices on the farm, or food safety on the farm, or if you're processing items, and I'll give you an example of a processed item. The health department views just shelling peas as a processing method that you must now have good manufacturing practices, or GMPs, in place. Next slide. Of course, anywhere the food chain, the product can be contaminated, and I know that growers like to basically point the fingers to consumers and cross-contamination, but just, we're all aware, anywhere from the farm to the table, this could be contaminated, and again, our major emphasis is trying to reduce the risk and prevent any animal or human fecal matter making contact with the produce. Next slide. Principle number four, which I think is key, I think anytime you see water, understand your water quality and what that means to your produce item. Next slide. Again, one area that's probably been big, at least in the organic program, has been the practice of using animal manures as a fertility method. Under FSMA, there will be no raw manure allowed. However, they are not going to challenge the National Organic Program's 90-day rule for raw manure for crops that are grown above the ground, or the 120-day rule for crops that are being grown in the ground. However, they will come back and revisit this in another 5 years to see where the organic standard falls into place. So if you're a certified organic producer, you will still, FSMA is not going to basically say you cannot use raw manure, raw animal manure. If you're not certified and you did use raw animal manure and you're supposed to be in compliance with the law, then that will be an area they could come down on you. So at this time, for certified organic growers, they are not going to, they're basically, I guess, allowing them because they are certified organic. Next slide. Hygiene, worker hygiene and sanitation. So certainly anywhere during the production, harvesting, you may have employees or yourself, or even some of the customers if you do a pick your own. You know, I think hygiene and sanitation, because there are some microbes, harmful microbes that are spread from humans to the produce item. So it's not strictly just wildlife, wild or domestic animals. Next slide. Of course, anything that GAPS entails is not to be in contradiction with any other laws. And I think I just gave an example with the National Organic Programs rules of the 90-day and 120-day. They're not going to be opposite of that particular law. However, only those people that are qualifying under the law will be able to continue in that manner. So again, follow all the laws and regulations based on how you're growing your crop. Next slide. Last but not least, principle number 8, which is again having record keeping, documentation. Obviously, if you're selling direct, you know, your trace back is pretty simple. But if you're selling to other individuals and they're reselling your product, you know, try to understand at least some sort of trace back documentation. Again, it's all about accountabilities at all the levels. On the farm, where that product gets packed, how it gets distributed, and how it's transported. And again, I think the idea is to basically raise the awareness of food safety and understanding of food safety, so you do have qualified personnel and there's effective procedures in place to basically increase the bar of food safety on produce. Next slide. Real briefly, I'm going to discuss some water concerns and basically, when you're washing produce after you harvested a crop, any water that you use in terms of harvesting the crop, it must be potable water or water equivalent to city or municipal grade water, and that's basically defined as water that has less than 2 generic E. coli per 100 mils. So with this water, you can wash your produce items, workers can wash their hands, you can transport, cool, and processing. So there's no other type of water that can be used for these processes. A lot of the questions that I've gotten in the past was, you know, I wash my produce item and I'm using municipal grade water. However, you know, there's still that potential that when we're washing produce items and the produce itself has a certain temperature, a core temperature, and the water has a certain temperature that you're using. Normally, when there's a 10-degree difference of Fahrenheit, pretty much either way, but generally speaking, we're going to be using cooler water. It can create basically a vacuum in which microbes could be pulled into the pores or the cuts or the abrasions of the plant, and that's just a physical thing that does occur. Next slide. So I guess the basic question is, you know, should you wash or should you not wash your produce item? Again, there have been many studies looking at sanitizers, and I know that maybe some of the sanitizers I may mention are not organic certified. There is one sanitizer that is organic certified, and that's Oxidate, and it's basically a type of hydrogen peroxide. It creates an oxidation that you could use to basically use as a sanitizer. So I'm not going to discuss the various studies, the clean green studies, or any of the specific other studies that have been done at Texas A&M, but I am going to pick one study to just kind of emphasize about what sanitizers do in the water. Next slide. So this is basically a study, and all we're going to really look at is just a plain water rinse or a water wash in comparing spinach, you know, however long they did it, washing the spinach with water, and I want to compare it basically to the ozonated water for 30 minutes, which is the very next column below it, which would be something similar to that oxidate material. It is not the oxidate material that was used, but it functions in the same way, in which there's an oxidation process or a giving off of oxygen that is very detrimental to microbes. So if we just generally just use regular regular municipal grade water to wash the spinach, we could reduce the E. coli count on the produce item by 0.7 and salmonella by 0.7, and we compare it to the ozonated water, which is a type of sanitizer, it would reduce at 0.6 for E. coli and 1. And basically you can look at anywhere from a 70% reduction to a 90% reduction of these microbes. So there was not an improved reduction of microbes using the ozonated water in comparison to just a regular municipal grade water wash. And so basically the purpose of these sanitizers is to keep the water clean, not to remove the microbes on the produce item. So we have always thought that we can put these sanitizers in the water to kill or reduce the microbial load on our produce item, and the reality is that does not happen. But sanitizers are important, if you do employ them, to keep the water clean, especially if you're reusing the water. If you're not reusing the water and it's going on through, and then I would not even be concerned of using sanitizers, because you're not having the potential for recontamination. Next slide. And I guess some of the take-home messages I want to emphasize, again, when we talked about, it was given in log reduction because that's how microbiologists talk. And the way we talk is, what does that all mean? So, the study basically showed 50 to 99% reduction. And when we hear 99% reduction, everybody thinks that's an excellent amount. Well, for microbes, that is not, that's still nowhere near. We were to reduce 99% of 6 million microbes, you're still left with a lot. So actually for microbes, to say that we have a kill step, or a step that basically eliminated them, and most of the time that involves heat, something thermal, we're talking about a 99.999% reduction. So sanitizers do not give us this. They just help. They're important in keeping the water clean and not causing a contamination because of the wash water. Again, prevention of contamination on the farm is the first line of defense in trying to clean up these, in trying to basically, instead of trying to clean them up with sanitizers. Next slide. And in this slide, I basically have pieces of information where you could that may help you in developing your food safety plan, basically maybe getting some for sale items. And the first website, we have the GAPS website at Cornell, and basically Cornell University is basically leading the charge, organizing the states in good agricultural practices, and so we can, as educators, all be discussing the same language and the same methods, so no one basically gets out of bounds and starts saying, well, this is a safe method and this is not a safe method. On the next website, we have onfarmfoodsafety.org that will, again, I want to emphasize is the place to go first. Again, it's for free service. You would log in, you would be a new user, try it, have it spit out your plan, and again, you can contact me either through email or phone, and I will be glad to look over it. I also have my own versions, what I call a short version and a long version, but I certainly want to at least have you begin at a certain place so you have something for me. We also have a website that has information. That's agrilifefoodsafety.tamu.edu. And for those that have an iPhone, we even have an app. It's just general information. It's also for free. And some of the things I discussed today, and certainly things that are written down that I may have discussed and things that are discussed in GAP's food safety training, is we do have an extension publication that's for sale at the AgriLife bookstore for $10. And with that, I'll be glad to end my presentation.
Thank you, Juan. We appreciate it. I know it's a topic that's oftentimes hard to understand. I will go right straight now, if you don't mind, going to some questions that were asked by the audience during the presentation. The first one I'll direct at you, Juan. Ask the question about, will USDA perform these audits that you mentioned?
Yes, USDA currently performs these audits. So I want to kind of differentiate what USDA can do and what maybe these other private companies can do. So if you're selling to a retailer that basically has this international presence, they're going to want you to be what they call this GFC, or Global Food Safety Initiative. They're going to want you to be go through those companies rather than USDA. But if you're not dealing with a retailer that has an international presence, and it's a domestic presence, and it's a local presence, or then this is where the USDA audit can work for you.
Okay, thank you. There's another question that someone has asked you. Could you elaborate a little bit about the 10-degree difference between the water that you mentioned?
Okay, well, I don't want to talk too much about the water, so we want to use municipal grade water to anything that we do post-harvest, washing our hands. Now, when we talk about irrigation water, that's the whole question when it comes, especially to surface water, whether that comes from rivers, canals, lakes. We all know that animals, wildlife, are there. So all those animals bring some kind of microbial load to the presence of surface water. So FDA's attempt to say this is good water, this is bad water, they were trying to actually take these numerical numbers, of which there was a lot of comments in this area. So their original number was basically based on people, on the Freshwater Act, of people going swimming into these freshwater bodies, which were, I would say, low numbers. Again, these are people actually jumping into the water, and there was really no research to say that kind of water, those microbes would move over to the produce. So the new number they've come up with is 410 generic E. coli per 100 mils. And again, it gets a little tricky, but at the same time, they did want to give growers an avenue where they couldn't. That if their surface water could not meet this 410 generic E. coli number, they'd have other avenues. And one of the other avenues would be days to harvest, or this microbial die-off. And some of the microbial die-off studies that we have done in Texas, we have shown that in 5 days after the last irrigation, these microbes die off enough that you reduce risk by 25 times. California has done the same studies, and they've come up with 4 days. So there are other avenues besides this good water, bad water threshold or number. So again, those are things that growers are going to have to implement in their plan and say, this is the science that says the water that I'm using is safe.
Thank you. We have another question that is asked about, you talked about the use of raw animal manures. The question is composted manure acceptable?
Yes. So in the beginning, when the comment period came up, the original comments was that people could use composted manure, thoroughly composted correctly, following the procedures to achieve that there would be a 45-day pre-harvest thing. This is the original one, and that you could use raw manure up to 9 months. Well, either way, there was lots of arguments in many different directions. You could probably just see that. So that what they basically did is they dropped the raw manure part. In other words, they're saying no raw manure unless you're organically certified. You will still be in compliance with the FSMA law, or you could do composted manure correctly, and there was no time frame in the days to harvest.
Okay, here's a question that's given to you from the corn producers. He's interested to know, does FSMA going to affect the corn producers also?
It's going to affect the what, Robert?
The corn producers, tree nuts.
Corn producers. Well, there is a long list of items, and I don't have that list in front of me, but there are tree nuts on that list, and I believe maybe even some tree nuts are exempt. So I could not honestly answer that question today without me looking at the list. So I'd rather pass, and she can email me, or they can email me, and I'd be glad to let them know. But there are basically some tree fruits and tree nuts that are not exempt.
Okay. Here's a comment and a question. A gentleman saying that oxidate has been taken out of the program, organic approved materials, at least by CCOF. He's asking, do you know of anything else that's been put in its place?
Well, I know that oxidate is an Armory approved, and I would say the agencies provided, that are doing the organic certification generally accept Armory approved products. So, so as far as I know, there are no organically certified sanitizers. I know that in the past we have done some projects with the University of Houston looking at just plain old vinegar, and looking at 50% vinegar, and so I guess my simple answer is, while we may not have simple sanitizers that are organically approved, and maybe we cannot go around endorsing homemade kind of things, I think this is an area where if you're going to depend on sanitizers and you're going to depend on reusing that water, that you may have to look for a way of not reusing that water and using just rinsing it and getting rid of that water.
Okay. Here's a quick question. Any idea as far as maybe a price range on third-party audits from the different places that you showed, from Primus and all those?
Yes, that's a very good question. I did do surveys when throughout the years here, trying to sort this out. So generally speaking, some of these audits are going to range. Your initial audit's going to range anywhere from $800 to $2,000, depending on how far the auditing company has to travel to get to you, because they're basically putting on all their costs into that thing. I'd say the most important thing is to pass that audit the first time and not have them come back again to double that cost. So I think that's where you need to do your homework and keep that cost down. I know that recently Chipotle restaurants were giving away grants or scholarships or awards to farming entities to pay for their audits. So again, I would approach your restaurants or the people that you sell to see if they are willing to take on some of the cost burden of this food safety compliance cost.
Another quick question: Where does someone who's way out in the rural area get his or her water tested for those different things you're talking about?
Oh, another good question. And so most of the water testing labs for microbes are in the big cities, and I know we encountered that problem when we were first getting involved. So these water tests are not like the regular water tests where you submit, see how salty your water is or what other chemicals, and you can have it laying around in your floorboard of your truck or your car for days before you got that done. So there's very specific criteria in which this water must be sent to the labs, and they must count the microbes at exactly 24 hours from the water collection. So to get this done correctly, you're going to have to work out the logistics of whether it's FedEx or whoever to deliver on time, get it to these laboratories. Be sure you're in communication with these laboratories so you do everything correctly and get the water tested. So generally, for a generic E. coli test, number is basically a third. It ranges from $20 to $45 per water sample, but generally an average of $30 per sample. So yeah, so it's not just any water test. There's, you're gonna have to put some time and effort into getting it done correctly.
Does that publication that you mentioned have a list of labs where you can get that done?
No, in that publication I did not put a list because there are so many labs. It's surprising how many labs can do it. It's just again, you could contact me, but pretty much if you contact a lab near a large city that you do business with, I am sure there is a laboratory there that can do it. But I do believe there is a lab list available from our working group, and I will try to see if I can get that to you all.
Another question is, in addition to GAP and GHP certificate, one of the growers is indicating that some of his customers are asking for a leafy green certificate. Do you know which particular labs will do that, or testing organizations?
Yes. So you're in Texas, and the California leafy greens is in California and Arizona. So I don't understand your buyer's question because you're outside the realm of this leafy green certification that they are doing internally in the state of California and Arizona. So okay. The California Leafy Greens Marketing Agreement is the one that's involved with that. And I've heard this before by several growers, so he's not the first, that, the retailers are asking for this, and I'm going, well, there's no way any of the inspectors from California or in Arizona are going to come outside the state to really do that, because they are doing their own little leafy greens, raising the bar of food safety for themselves.
Okay. Another question that's related again to this 10 degrees of difference in water. I think the question is confusing whether you really said that the degree should not be more than 10 degrees different, or you were just saying that if it is more than 10 degrees different than the temperature of the produce, then certain processes happen. Could you clarify that again, please, Juan?
Yes, I'll be glad to clarify that. So let's suppose the core temperature of your produce item was 75 degrees and your water temperature was 64 degrees, in other words, 11 degrees colder. In that scenario, there's the possibility, we know that when there's more than 10 degrees, any place where you cut or nicked, or even some of the natural pores, or even, for example, tomatoes, when you pluck a tomato, water actually moves into that area. It's able to move into the plant, and actually it's sort of by a vacuum process, or a physical or physics process that occurs. Okay, so what I want people to understand is that make sure that the water you use is extremely clean, because if it has any kind of microbes, that's going to be an avenue to basically push them in or suck them into the produce item.
Okay. Another question about audits. If a grower fails an audit, how soon can he or she get retested, and does it cost more?
Well, of course they can get retested. Again, and the question was, when do the auditing companies come? Well, I would say my experience has been you can call them today, and they may say we can't be there till 2 or 3 months from now. They're not companies that say, well, you need me today, I'll be there on Monday. That's been my experience. So they're I don't want to say they're slow, maybe they're busy. The thing is that there's a time lag by time. It's kind of like going to the doctor. You may need to go see the doctor, but they're going to schedule you in a month or 2 from now. And that's the same thing with these companies. So yes, you can always redo an audit with the same company. I would say I don't think they're charging you any more per hour, but they may take longer, and that bill may be larger in the second audit, but they're not actually. And my experience has been many individual growers have failed the first audit, and they take the second audit and they make the corrections based on the auditor, and they fly through much faster. So that's been my understanding of how the audit process has worked.
Okay. Another question that relates to washing. This person says, does a produce farm have to do post-harvest washing? We grow microgreens, and washing affects their shelf life.
Yes, another question I've heard from growers, and I would say, there are retailers that are demanding this of growers, which, they're saying, if you're going to send me the item, I need you to wash it. And I'm like, well, we know it's safer if you don't wash it versus washing it. Doesn't seem to be getting through to them, but yes, I can see where retailers are asking for it, but there is no law that says you must wash this, and I don't believe in FSMA there will be any such thing along those lines, but retailers are asking for that.
Okay. Well, Juan and Susie, we appreciate your participation. For all you folks that are still listening and watching, we will answer your questions if you want to keep sending us our questions. And I just would remind you as you sign off to please remember to fill out the survey. It'll help us in the future make sure our webinars are better. So I will thank everybody again and say hope you have a good day.